Okay, so next we are going to talk about pests and diseases. Plants in containers are subject to the same pests as ingrown plants. Like snails and powdery mildew, it doesn't change. Maybe depending on where you put your container, there's less chance of exposure, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to be there. You may need to cover or cage your container garden to guard against birds, squirrels, and other critters. And you can also get aphid, whitefly, and fungus gnats indoors. Containers are wonderful and they can help mitigate some of these problems, but they don't keep these problems at bay. So with that, let's talk about integrated pest management. The University of Nevada, Reno encourages home gardeners to manage pests by using integrated pest management, that everyone refers to as IPM. It is a science-based strategy to manage the damaged pests, which are insects, disease, vertebrate pests, and weeds, can cause to the garden or your container. So there are definite advantages to an IPM program. It minimizes the use of dangerous chemicals. It helps you grow healthy plants that can resist pests, and it encourages beneficial insects to control the insect pests for you. So the main element of IPM is to accept that a certain amount of disease or pest damage can be tolerated in our home gardens. Homegrown fruits and vegetables don't need to look grocery store perfect in order to be healthy and delicious. So providing growing conditions that produce strong and healthy plants that resist pests. It's good garden planning, soil preparation, plant selection and spacing, correct watering and fertilizing, regular weeding and mulching, encourage pests' natural enemies. So in outdoor containers, that would be beneficial insects, birds, and lizards. And again, this minimizes the health and environmental risks by using physical controls first. So I want to go back to that we need to accept that a certain amount of disease or pest damage can be tolerated. This is a personal choice. Everyone is different. And if you see a few aphid on your plant, if you take a pause, you might go, you know what? Those few aphid, they're not doing anything. I'm okay with that. I'm just going to leave it there. Maybe I'm going to use a hose and squirt it off. Maybe I'm going to hope that some other predator insects come in and take care of those, and that's fine. But you also may have a zero insect tolerance, and you may not be able to handle or tolerate one or two aphid on your plant, or whitefly, or fungus gnat. And so you're going to have to make the choices that are right for you. But ideally, we want to decrease the use of pesticides and allow other things to happen. Generally speaking, in your garden outside, if you do have, say, an aphid infestation where you see a lot of aphid on your plants, oftentimes if you are patient and you use some physical methods like hosing off the plant to knock the aphid off the plants, you will see a migration of beneficial insects that come in and feed on those pests that we don't want. And oftentimes people are like, well, why do we have to wait? Why aren't they there? Why do I have them if we have beneficial insects? But if there isn't a food source for those beneficial insects, they're not going to live there. They have to live with their food. But once we have those pests, the beneficial insects are likely to come in. And you also can purchase beneficial insects from nurseries and that kind of thing. Often we hear people bringing in ladybug larvae and those kinds of things. But keep in mind, they're only going to stay where their food source is. So if you bring in ladybugs or ladybug larvae, which are actually much more effective at controlling pests, once that food source is gone, once they've done their job, they're going to go looking for food and may not stay in your garden. So that's just something to think about there. So insect pests. These are common household houseplant pests, but with healthy, happy plants and good maintenance practices, they are rarely deadly. So aphids, scale, mealybugs, thrips, spider mites, and fungus gnats are all pests that we commonly see in container plants in the home. And so you might be saying, well, how can I have this if it's inside? There's no aphids inside, but you know what? If you walk inside and outside, you can bring those pests with you. If you have children, if you have cats or dogs, if you open your windows without a screen, many of these things can come in. They also are really common in soils. So when you buy nursery stock from nurseries or box stores, the eggs or the pests themselves can come in the soils or on those plants and then spread to other areas. And then also it's kind of our cultural practices as well. Fungus gnats really like that wet soil to lay their eggs and thrive in. And so if we're keeping our house plants too wet, it's a perfect breeding ground for fungus gnats. So here is an insect pest inside. If you see on the first picture there on the left, that leaf is curled. That leaf is a lamb sorrel, and it should be flat. And so seeing that is an indicator that something's wrong. So you open up that leaf, and you can see all that stuff on the inside. And on a closer look up, that is a lot of aphid. And that's not something that you would have seen from the outside in the first picture. You have to open it up and kind of see what's going on. In that last picture, you can see it's kind of been there for a while. There's a lot of honeydew on the plant. We have aphid carcass on there that are dead and gone, and new growth. So there's definitely a couple generations of aphid living on there. So that's something that we would want to look at and take care of. And a lot of times with house plants, because we're not looking for those insects and those pests, something gets to a really high level before we notice it. So when you're watering it, take your time to take a look at it. And then let's look here at some diseases. Fungal leaf spots from wet foliage is really common. Fungal root rot from wet, soggy soil, and then also, again, bringing in fungus gnats as well. And then bacterial foliar diseases from higher humidity and temperatures, crowding, or poor air circulation. So even though we are in a really dry climate, oftentimes with indoor container plants, we have a tendency to crowd them all together. And then if you're doing overhead watering where the foliage gets wet and there's not good air circulation, that can create little microclimates that are perfect for a disease or bacteria to grow, and then that spreads to the plants and it goes from there. These are common household diseases, but with healthy, happy plants, they are not often problems. But if you do find you have a plant that suffers from a disease, you will want to throw it out so that it doesn't infect your other plants. Do not compost it. You can't guarantee that your compost pile will reach a high enough temperature to kill off the pathogens. You just kind of want to get rid of it. And you don't want to keep it in your house really either, because bacteria and diseases can be transported from if you touch that plant and go to another plant. If it's on your clothes, it can move through the air or through your pets. So you really do, as sad as it sounds, just want to kind of get rid of that plant if you have an actual disease. So let's talk a little bit about using physical controls, again, as part of the IPM method. Physical controls, using your hose to squirt down the plant to knock off the pests that are on there. Physical controls first is a great way. And then squishing or trapping them. If there's not a lot, you can use tape to pull squash bug eggs off the back of your plant, squish them with your fingers. And then, of course, physical barriers around stem, twigs, or trunks. In this picture here, we can see we have a cage around this to keep vertebrate pests like squirrels and deer off these plants. But physical barriers are a great way to avoid using pesticides, still have healthy, happy plants. So that's great. And then here we are, humans as pests. There's lots of cartoons about humans as pests, but for plants, we are a pretty big pest. We transport the plants home from the nursery into our houses incorrectly. We make mistakes with handling, with watering, with fertilizing. Sometimes we have a house plant with the leaves aren't shiny and we want to buff them, and then we damage the cell structure of their leaves, all those kinds of things. So we actually are probably the biggest threat to houseplants. So just kind of keep that in mind. And then there's indoor container pests, right? We have this fella here. And if you look closely, look deep into those eyes, there is no intention of moving for this vertebrate pest. So here the IPM principle of exclusion applies. I placed bamboo barbecue skewers all through the greens so that this bed would no longer be so comfortable and inviting for this vertebrate pest. Okay, so let's talk about perennials in containers like flowers or rhubarb. With a properly sized container and the right planting mix and the right conditions, many plants will grow for many years in a container. But if you do begin to notice that the container is drying too quickly, or it takes too long for the water to percolate through the soil, or you see that the roots are protruding through the holes or coming at the top, it's time to replant that plant or repot that plant. So in this picture here, this is a perennial. It's a sweet woodruff plant, and this is breaking dormancy for the year, and it's about 2 years old, and you can see that the roots are just circling around the top of the container, and it needs to be repotted. Okay, let's talk about combination planting. Mixing flowers and vegetables in the same container, mixing vegetables and flowers in containers near each other, mixing container plantings with in-ground plantings. So you have a beautiful bed, but then you have a couple big pots or containers to put a spotlight on something or to have a spillover effect. And then mixing tall vegetables with short herbs or flowers. These are all different ways to combine things. So here, we see a container with herbs in front and flowers in back. It's very visually pleasing, and it's also very functional. Here we see all different manner of plants in different containers in the same area. We have some that are just peppers or tomatoes and some that are flowers. So it looks really beautiful, but what this does is it creates a really healthy environment for those plants. It brings in pollinators. There's still airflow. You can do different fertilizing needs for each individual plant if need be, that type of thing. And then here we can see an indoor mix and match can create a beautiful visual element that can be moved around easily. So if you wanted to bring in, like we have those white blooming flowers in the front, if we wanted to switch those out and constantly have that one change the blooming flower, but keeping the foliage and the evergreens, it's really easy to do. You still get a nice full effect there. And so the best varieties adapted to container culture are often labeled so, right? So the right size plants for what you're doing, right? And so the right size ones are often labeled with words like bush or patio, dwarf, or determinate in the name. And those are all things that kind of give you a clue that they might be right for a container. So a bush plant is something that's not going to grow, like for example, let's say a bush tomato versus an indeterminate tomato. A bush tomato grows into like a shrub-like size. It doesn't continue to grow. Most of the fruit comes on at the same time. It's really suitable for being in a container. But an indeterminate tomato can grow sometimes 12, 16 to 20 feet in length, produces fruit the whole time, which is wonderful in smaller amounts, but more consistent. But having a 20-foot vine in a container can be really difficult to manage. Doesn't mean that you can't. Again, going back to the principles, like this is kind of a recipe and you're going to figure out what works for you. Just because you don't have the perfect plant or the perfect container doesn't mean you can't do it. You just have to be aware of it so you can make the right choices or know how to maintain it. So again, look for bush, patio, dwarf, or determinate in the name when making your plant choices when you're starting out to make sure that you're getting a plant that you'll be successful with. Here, for example, is a container nepeta or catmint. It's a hardy perennial here in northern Nevada. It's a great pollinator plant. It's a Mediterranean plant, so it can handle the dry heat in Las Vegas as well, in the southern area. So it's pretty awesome. And here it's breaking dormancy for the winter. This is one of my favorite pollinator plants, and I always incorporate it into my vegetable container gardens because it does so well in a container and overwinters nicely. If you cut it back after it blooms, you can get 2 or 3 blooms on it, depending on the season, and it's a great container plant. Here is an example of 2 types of tomatoes, one dwarf labeled as a tabletop and the other a regular indeterminate tomato. So we just use that as an example, but you can see the indeterminate tomato, it is grown in a 5-gallon container with supports. It's got prolific fruit, but it is really big. And then the one on the right, this tabletop variety, also is producing fruit, but in a very small container. Here is another variety of peppers, the same thing, and then a tomato, specifically for small space container growing. That pepper is, in a 3-inch pot, and it will be producing peppers in that we'll be able to harvest. And the same thing on the right with the tomatoes, that little tabletop variety is producing fruit, and we'll do that in that small area. So they're great for containers as well. This is just another side view of that same plant, so you can see the fruit production on that. So I can't name them all, and none of these sites that are listed in here are better than any others, but they are some good places to start looking, and you can dial it in from there. Because container gardening's become much more popular, here's just a few places that have searchable options for vegetable varieties that grow well in containers. And the same thing is available on many of these sites for plants and flowers that are really well suited to growing in containers as well. But again, does that mean that you can't grow a full-size pumpkin in a container on your patio in your apartment? No, it doesn't. Does that mean that you can't grow a dwarf lemon tree in a container on your patio? No, it doesn't. You just need to know what the plant needs are and what you have available, and then make the appropriate choices with additional watering, additional feeding, moving in and out of doors depending on the heat tolerance, the cold tolerance of the plant, and those kinds of things. So part of it is your commitment to what you're willing to do. If you want it to be plant it and forget it, super easy. You want to make sure that you're getting a variety of an ornamental flower or a vegetable or an herb that is suited for that container, so you don't have to do a lot of maintenance. Or maybe you're like, nope, this is really what I want because I love to look at this flower or I love to eat that fruit or vegetable, and this is what I'm willing to do in order to have it. So selecting the best vegetables for you, plan what you already eat is the best way to start, right? Selecting the best vegetables. You can grow most annual vegetables in containers. Also, vining crops like squash, pumpkins, and melons that require more space. There are now definitely new cultivars that are suitable for containers. Bush type squash and cucumbers and melons that grow as compact bushes rather than sprawling vines. And when choosing tomatoes, look for determinate cultivars that grow to predetermined height instead of an indeterminate tomato, which, as we talked about, can grow too tall, 16 to 20 feet sometimes. And then generally speaking, just again, look at the size. A half-gallon container is good for beets 2 to 3 inches apart, or Swiss chard, or lettuce or herbs. A gallon container is good for a cherry tomato. 2-gallon containers are good for bush beans or bell peppers, and 5-gallon containers are good for cucumbers, eggplants, squash, or tomatoes. And again, these are just general rules. Here is a quick list of sizes. And again, you're going to need to look in the chapters for more detailed or information that you can look up more readily, because I know this is pretty small to look at, but just so you can see that during our talk. Many resources are online for finding the size requirements for container planning, and also if you're starting from seed, that information will be available on your seed packet. It's a great resource, so make sure you look at those. Here we see hanging baskets. These are great container options. They can sit on the floor, they can hang. Here we have nasturtiums. It's a beautiful flower with edible flowers and leaves. So it's a great edible ornamental annual, double bang for your buck. Here is a list of vegetables well suited for summer container gardening. Potatoes, chard, lettuce, cherry, and bush tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, summer squash, Asian greens, and pole beans. And don't forget about herbs. Again, you can do something different, get away with less space for soil. This is just a recipe, and you're the gardener, so experiment. This is to kind of give you an idea of the ideal, but you also want to look at practical application. So again, let's look at it a little bit differently. Let's look at soil depths, maybe not just container sizes, like 5-gallon or 10-gallon containers. Let's look at root depth. Chives, lettuce, radish, and other salad greens or basils are really good in the 4 to 5 inch shallow container, picking lettuces, all that kind of stuff. Bush beans, garlic, kohlrabi, onions, Asian greens, peas, mint, and thyme need to have a deeper container, 6 to 7 inches. Pole beans, carrots, chard, cucumbers, eggplant, fennel, leeks, peppers, spinach, parsley, and rosemary, even deeper, 8 to 9 inches. And then things like beets, broccoli, okra, potatoes, sweet corn, summer squash, dill, or lemongrass need to be at least 10 to 12 inches or even bigger than that, depending on how long you plan on growing them for. Herbs that are well suited for summer container gardening. Parsley, sage, cilantro, thyme, rosemary. You can read the rest of them on here. Mints, We recommend that you always plant those separately because they are so aggressive. I mean, they're wonderful and we love them, but they can take over your garden. So we try to recommend putting them in their own container always, or if you're going to do it in a raised bed, put them in a pot inside a raised bed so you can keep them from overtaking and becoming invasive. When combining several different types of plants in one pot, it's best to match plants that have a similar need for water and fertilizer. So, for example, rosemary, which likes hot and relatively dry conditions, would be a good match with water, or would not be a good match with water hungry cucumbers, right? So if you water for the cucumbers to keep them from wilting, then the rosemary is going to die because, or at least not thrive because it's getting too much water. So kind of keep that in mind when you're doing companion planting in the same pot. To maximize space, you might want to combine a trailing plant with an upright plant. Some plants actually grow better when grown near a compatible companion. The book Carrots Love Tomatoes is a great resource for companion planting. On the other hand, some plants don't seem to grow as well when paired with certain plants. So sometimes the reasons are simple, like carrots, dill, and fennel are all in the same family and will compete for the same nutrients. So that doesn't mean that you can't plant them together, right? Even though they're going to use up all the same resources and they're going to have the same deficiencies. But if you know that ahead of time and that's how you want to plant them, then you would fertilize accordingly, maybe adding more fertilizer than is normally called for because you know it's going to be depleted faster in that particular container. And then think about theme planting, right? We have an Italian container, a salsa garden, or a max production garden. There's lots of different options that you can do within your container and have a lot of fun with it. So good companion plants, beets, carrots, and squash, right? We hear about the three sisters all the time. Eggplants and beans, tomato, basils, and onions, lettuces and herbs, spinach, chard, and onions. Here I love this little picture of radish in a container because they're great fresh eating. You can let them grow a long time until they're spicy. You can eat them when they're brand new and they're kind of sweet. Combinations to avoid: beans with onions and garlic, carrots with dill or fennel, tomatoes or squash with potatoes, and onions with beans and peas. And a lot of this you can see is things that use the same resources or are in the same families. So growing your own food is satisfying and rewarding. And if you want to try your hand at self-sufficiency but have been hesitant for lack of space or confidence, starting a small victory garden in a container is the way to go. You can add containers as your confidence builds and try new vegetables or varieties of ones that you particularly love or a fellow master gardener has shared their love of and you want to try it. Containers are a great way to involve children in first-time gardening, as well as they are easier to plant, tend, and harvest, which makes container gardens great for accessibility. I don't know about you, but man, getting up and down off my knees is getting harder and harder by the year. And so having those raised beds or those containers is definitely pleasing for my body. So don't let space or confidence stop you. Definitely try, and containers are a great place to start. Flower containers. Flowers in containers do some really beautiful things. Here we see the two really contrasting colors. It's bright, it's beautiful, it draws our eyes right over. When choosing plants for flower containers, consider the following. Will the size of the plant as stated on the tag meet your needs, right? So if you plant something that is supposed to grow into maturity, 5 to 10 feet in size, is that going to fit in your container? Is that going to fit in that location? You want to make sure that you know that going into it. Do the growing requirements of the plant coincide with the location of the container? Are you placing it in full sun, shade, or part sun and shade? You may feature just one plant in each pot, as you see in this picture, or consider the thrill, fill, and spill concept, which we'll go over here in just a second. Or you may choose to keep it really simple. Having flowers brings in pollinators, and while beautiful, also helps your gardens grow and support our pollinator communities. So flowers feed our soul, vegetables, and our bellies. So keep that in mind. So here is a spiller design. Spillers are plants that would be ground covers if they were planted in the landscape or how they naturally grow in their native environment. They have long pendulous branches and often beautiful flowers or foliage. So these is a basket that you can see. We've got a sweet potato vine, which is that bright lime green that's hanging down with some of those other plants that normally would vine on the ground, but it's great in uh, a hanging basket or also in a container to spill over the sides. Thriller design. Thrillers give you your container height. They might be in the middle of your container or towards the back. If the container is up against a wall, they provide drama and interest, and their texture is often coarse. So we can see here we've got the spiller going down the side. We've got the thriller that draws our eye into the middle and up. And then we have the filler design. Fillers help to fill the gaps between our vertical elements and the cascading elements of our spillers. These are erect plants that often flower but continue and contribute to the design even if they don't flower. So like in this, we have those beautiful bright pink flowers, but if that plant wasn't flowering, the dark green leaf contrasts nicely with the spiller element, so it still has a beautiful element to this design here. With just a pot of colorful zinnias or a barrel of red peppers, you can brighten up a dull area of your garden. By following these tips, you can grow almost anything in a container that grows in the ground. So for outside maintenance, again, you want to periodically check for insects and disease. Good time to do this is just look around when you're walking your irrigation system, whether it's a flowering, ornamental container garden or a vegetable or herb container garden. Still check for diseases and insects. Look for discolored leaves, additional growth, failing plants, or maybe bites or parts of leaves missing, those kinds of things. Shelter containers in severe weather. So what is severe weather? Well, it can be extreme heat or extreme cold here, but it can also be things like a wind event or an unusual hailstorm or something like that. Remove spent flowers and leaves and harvest fruit and vegetables when ripe. Those are probably two of the most important things in either flower or vegetable production. Removing those spent flowers and leaves will really significantly decrease the chance for disease growth, disease and bacteria, and it also removes places for pests to hang out and live and congregate in your plants. So getting rid of those and then harvesting fruits and vegetables when they're ripe. Leaving ripe fruit on the vine or the tree or the bush to decay just brings in tons of disease and also tons of insects. So we want to make sure that we're getting those out of there. And then continue to feed your plants as needed, walk your irrigation again, and then enjoy your flowers and your harvest. Okay, let's talk about maintenance inside. Some general maintenance, your house plants can remain healthy and happy for sure. So things that are different inside than outside. Dust. You need a damp cloth or a feather duster to clean off your plants because the pores, they don't get the overhead rain, sprinklers or any of that kind of stuff. You don't have the same kind of wind and air movement. It actually can clog the pores on the leaves and kind of slow the system down. So you want to dust them. You want to give them a shower every once in a while with a hand mister, or sometimes I put them in the shower. Sometimes, and I know this is probably a little bit of overkill for some of you, but if it's a really light rain, which we don't get often, but when we do, I'll often run around the house and get all my plants and take them outside so we can just have a light rain on them and kind of clean them off. Sometimes I'll put them in the shower as well. Turn your plants regularly. We talked about light exposure, and if we turn it on a regular basis, it creates a fuller, more well-developed plant. Trim the tips and the margins of your plants to make sure that we only have new healthy growth on there, and then remove yellow or discolored foliage. Once that foliage turns yellow, it's never going to turn green again. So let's just go ahead and remove it so all the energy of the plant and all the nutrients go towards healthy new life production instead of old and decaying plant. So again, today we went over size and type of containers, lighting, environmental protections, support, planting media, irrigation, fertilization, when to plant, think about combinations, and what to plant. All these things go into a healthy container gardening experience, whether it's inside or outside or a combination of both. Thank you so much for being here today and for being a part of the Master Gardener program, whether it's the Home Horticulture Certificate program or the Master Gardener program. Being a part of a volunteer organization like this definitely makes this a better place to be, and I am glad you chose to be a part of it. All right, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly. Remember that there is a lot more detailed information in your chapters, and there's lots of attachments and links, so please make sure that you go through that. And again, also remember that Nevada is a very large geographic state with very diverse areas to grow in. And even within smaller areas, there's lots of microclimates, either with elevation or building structures or those kinds of things. So take the time to understand your area, take your time to understand your sun exposure and your weather exposures inside and out. And then make good plant choices by researching what the plant needs are before you plant. And you're destined to have a great container gardening experience. All right, thank you.